What draws us to places the world has chosen to forget? Maybe it's the silence, dense and complete, that seems to keep time itself at bay. Maybe it's the way sunlight finds a crack in boarded windows and turns dust into a record of absent hands. Whatever the pull, abandoned places hold more than peeling paint and rusted metal. They are archives of choices, failures, and lives that once moved through those hallways. This is an exploration of the darker histories hidden inside ruins, the industrial dreams that swallowed communities, the institutions that broke people instead of healing them, the natural world that reclaims what was taken. These are not thrill-seeker tales. They are stories about people and the costs of ambition, neglect, and violence. Chernobyl and Pripyat, Ukraine, then USSR, 1986. The image is almost unavoidable. A rusting Ferris wheel silhouetted against an empty fairground. Carousel horses frozen mid-arc in a schoolyard where no children laugh. On April 26, 1986, a reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant failed in a catastrophic explosion. The city of Pripyat, built to house workers and their families, was evacuated within days. The evacuation was fast, bureaucratic, and incomplete in ways that would take decades to unpack. Reports vary on the toll exacted by the accident and the cleanup that followed. Estimates depend heavily on which studies and which years are referenced. What is undisputed is that whole neighborhoods turned overnight from everyday life into an exclusion zone, and the ruins kept those abrupt absences as evidence. The darker secrets here are both technical and moral. First, there was the human error and systemic failure that precipitated the disaster. Decisions taken in a culture that prized secrecy and production over transparency. Then came the cover-up, the delays, the orders that sent unprotected men into lethal conditions to try to contain a disaster no one was prepared for. In the immediate aftermath, responses were improvised, and many of the worst consequences only became visible years later. Cancers, displaced families, fractured communities. These are matters of ongoing study. Scientists and historians still debate long-term health consequences and the precise human cost. It is important to say this clearly. When discussing numbers, phrasing must reflect uncertainty. Reports vary, and estimates suggest ranges rather than absolutes. One of the more haunting images from Pripyat is not a building, but a machine. An old construction crane near the power plant, whose boom lurks like a mechanical claw above the trees. Local explorers and some workers refer to it with a nickname, the Death Claw, because doses measured in and around its cabin remained ominously high for years. Whether or not every sensational account is accurate, the crane functions as a symbol. Machines meant to build and repair became relics of a failure that no machine could fix. Today, parts of the exclusion zone are accessible only under strict supervision. Licensed tours operate with measured routes, trained guides, and radiation monitors. The greatest danger is not monsters, but invisible contamination and unstable structures. Authorities warn against trespassing. Radiation hotspots persist, and many buildings are structurally unsound. What remains in Pripyat is freighted with absence. Toys still scattered in classrooms, paint peeling from murals in community centers. These objects are not curiosities to be commodified. They are evidence of lives interrupted. Visiting is possible for those who do so legally, respectfully, and with awareness of both safety and the people for whom the place is still a living wound. If this exploration interests you, hit like to see more deep dives into these uneasy spaces. From radioactive exclusion to a very different kind of desertion. Kolmanskop, Namibia, a settlement that rose and fell with the fortunes of diamond mining. Located in southwestern Namibia, Kolmanskop became a boomtown in the early 20th century after diamonds were discovered beneath the desert sands. For a time, it was a European enclave of sudden wealth. Houses with carved wood and ornate fittings, a hospital, a school, and a casino. The town's decline began as newer, richer diamond finds emerged elsewhere, and the original deposits were exhausted. By the 1920s and 1930s, the mine owners followed opportunity, and residents left the town where they had once hoped to build permanence. The secret buried by the shifting sands is not merely the ephemeral nature of resource booms, but the underlying human cost. The extraction that enriched a few relied on colonial power structures that displaced and exploited local populations. Sand now pours through doorways like an hourglass moving backward. Bedrooms fill with ripples of dunes, and in winter light, whole corridors glow with a spectral hush. The desert does not care for sentiment. It reclaims and conceals what human hands have abandoned. Today, Kolmanskop stands as a tourism site with controlled access, a reminder that landscapes of extraction are also memorials for forgotten labor. Visiting is allowed, often with guides who explain the history, but the history itself resists tidy comfort. Reports and testimonials suggest the town's first prosperity came at the expense of local communities, and what remains feels less romantic than culpable. In a northern land where water and concrete meet, Rumu Quarry in Estonia reveals a different kind of uncanny beauty. Rumu, an underwater graveyard of machines and buildings, was once an industrial limestone quarry, operated in part by prisoners from a nearby training camp during the Soviet era. When quarry operations ceased, groundwater pumped in and flooded the pit, creating a turquoise lake that submerged concrete platforms, rebar, and stairwells. Sunlight transforms this scene into a siren call for urbex photographers and swimmers. The water is an impossible blue set against graying ruins. The darker truth beneath the water is that the site's origins are tethered to forced labor and punitive systems. Estimates and recollections vary, and some accounts remain contested. Historians advise caution when citing casualty figures or assigning singular narratives. Beyond the past, the site is deceptively dangerous today. Submerged machinery, sudden drop-offs, cold water, and entanglement hazards have led to accidents among those who swim or dive there without proper preparation. Local authorities have issued warnings and imposed restrictions precisely because the place is unstable and sometimes legally protected. The clear, inviting water should not be mistaken for harmlessness. It covers history and hazard in equal measure. Abandoned hospitals, sanatoriums, and asylum complexes are places where architecture was intended to make the invisible visible, illness and pain brought into light. But too often the institutions themselves absorbed harm instead of providing care. Take the sprawling complexes built in Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Sanatoriums designed for tuberculosis patients, psychiatric hospitals that promised treatment but became overrun, wartime hospitals transformed into sites of secrecy and suffering. Some complexes, now silent, carried prominent patients through moments of fame and infamy. Others were the settings of forgotten tragedies, fires, overcrowding, neglect, and sometimes abuse that survivors and historians have had to piece together from shards of testimony. When speaking of places like Beilitz Heilstätten near Berlin, or North American institutions that once housed both the elite and the stigmatized, the history resists simple moral diagrams. Beilitz, built at the turn of the 20th century and used as a military hospital during World War I, later stood empty in parts for decades. Some buildings have been restored, others cling to decay. Stories that circulate among explorers and local historians include accounts of experimental treatments, of patients who were isolated not only by disease, but also by social shame. In Scotland, mansions converted into psychiatric hospitals, often secluded by landscaped grounds, became both sanctuaries and prisons depending on the era and the practice. Again, details vary by source. When discussing alleged abuses, it is critical to phrase claims as "reports indicate" or "survivors remember," rather than as undisputed facts, because archives, testimonies, and official records sometimes tell different stories. Old medical buildings carry an obvious ethical tension for anyone who films or enters them. Objects left in situ, beds, charts, ceramic jugs, are traces of human vulnerability. Are they relics to be documented? Or are they private remnants that deserve privacy even in their abandoned state? There is no single answer, but a guiding principle should be respect. Many countries have laws protecting medical records and grave sites. Structural instability is common in long empty hospitals, and the risk of biohazardous material, from asbestos to mold to improperly stored chemicals, is real. Legal tours, preservation efforts, and museum conversions offer one path. They make history accessible without turning suffering into a spectacle. Not all ruins are the product of industry or illness. Sometimes they are the result of human pleasure and ambition blown off course. The Haludovo Palace Hotel on the Croatian island of Krk once opened with the promise of glamour, beachfront suites, casinos, and a vision of tourist money flowing into a coastal resort. Built in the 1970s during Yugoslavia's more cosmopolitan tourist expansion, Haludovo later became a casualty of geopolitical fracture. The Croatian War of Independence in the early 1990s, followed by economic collapse and lawlessness, turned many such resorts into easy targets for looting and neglect. Haludovo's marble halls and branded luxury went from celebration to abandonment, and the rooms that once hosted slot machines and champagne now collect graffiti and desertion. The darker secret of Haludovo is how swiftly luxury can invert into loss. Investments vanish, staff and guests become refugees of circumstance, and what once represented a promise of leisure becomes an indictment of instability. Photographs show ballroom chandeliers tangled in vines and tiles cracked by weather and neglect. Local voices remember the wealth and the subsequent unraveling. Others caution that some narratives about celebrity investors or sensational incidents are later embellishments. Today, Haludovo stands as a cautionary postcard. Prosperity built on shaky political ground can disappear, and the physical structure becomes a ledger of human disappointment. Across oceans and political systems, the story repeats in different keys. Bokor Hill Station in Cambodia was conceived as a hilltop refuge, a colonial-era resort where Europeans could escape lowland heat, with a casino meant to attract visitors. Built during French colonial times and expanded in the early 20th century, Bokor later became entangled with the country's violent mid-century upheavals. The resort's long history includes periods when the area served as a military stronghold and when construction itself took a heavy toll on laborers. Local accounts and some historical reports suggest that many workers died during construction. Exact numbers vary between sources, and historians urge caution in citing particular figures. But the human sacrifice embedded in the site's foundations is widely acknowledged in oral histories. Now the hill station sits half swallowed by a tropical forest. The combinational scent of damp wood, rust, and moss creates an atmosphere that is both romantic and unsettling. Pieces of colonial architecture stand like stage props reclaimed by vines. For visitors and photographers, Bokor offers sculptural decay. For local communities, it is also a reminder of a history of labor and displacement. Safety considerations here are practical. Abandoned structures can be unstable, and the surrounding terrain may hide old munitions or other hazards in a country that endured conflict for decades. Respecting local communities' memories and property rights is essential when engaging with this kind of ruin. Some ruins are so intertwined with public health crises that their histories remain politically charged. Blackwell Island, today known as Roosevelt Island, in New York City, carries layered uses and transformations. In the 19th century, the island hosted hospitals for smallpox and other contagious diseases, as well as prisons and almshouses. Buildings that once quarantined the sick or isolated the marginalized later became obsolete or were repurposed. The ruins of a smallpox hospital, designed in a Gothic style by James Renwick Jr., stand in memory more than in use, a stone skeleton that hints at the panic and policies of earlier eras. The ethical complication with sites like Blackwell Island is that the people who suffered there were often the most vulnerable in society: the poor, immigrants, and those with stigmatized illnesses. When modern visitors treat such places as atmospheric backdrops, there is a risk of trivializing the social and medical conditions that led to quarantine policies and institutional segregation. It is worth remembering that public health architecture is not scenic if seen only as decay. It is an artifact of past attitudes toward disease, poverty, and who was made to bear society's burdens. Across these varied examples, a few patterns emerge. Abandonment may follow economic shifts, mines run dry, fashion changes, tourists move on, but it is rarely neutral. Abandonment often follows violence, exploitation, disease, or political collapse. And in each case, the material leftovers are not empty. They contain stories, some cataloged in newspapers and archives, others preserved only in the memories of survivors or in the silence of a child's forgotten toy. There is also a recurring tension between the desire to document and the need to protect. Ruins can be fragile, and public interest sometimes brings unwelcome wear. Popular exposure can spawn souvenir hunters, illegal entry, and illicit salvage. At the same time, documentation can galvanize preservation or memorial efforts that honor the past and support communities affected by it. Responsible engagement matters. Follow the law, listen to local caretakers, avoid touching or removing artifacts, and treat human traces with dignity. These ethical stakes are not abstract. Consider the case of a castle in Europe that became bound up with orphanage operations and later allegations of mistreatment. Locally known as Chateau Miranda, the building had been a 19th century neo-Gothic retreat before parts of it served as a shelter for children in the 20th century. Over time, rumors and reports circulated about neglect and abuse during the periods when vulnerable children lived within its walls. Some of these allegations have been documented in investigative reports and survivor accounts. Others live in the realm of local lore. The castle's physical decline culminated in partial collapse and, ultimately, demolition, an erasure that denied the possibility of transforming the site into a careful memorial. The lesson is blunt. Neglect does not end cleanly. When institutions fail their charges, the material record can erase as much as it reveals. For every ruin that becomes an object of curiosity in photography and film, there are people for whom these places are repositories of grief. Descendants of workers from a submerged quarry, of families uprooted from mining towns, of patients who were never properly discharged. They live with the afterlives of these sites. That reality complicates the impulse to document. Who benefits from the spotlight? Who feels re-traumatized by repeated exposures of the same images? These are questions with no easy answers, but they must temper the narratorial instinct to aestheticize ruin. As the journey moves on from coastal casinos and hilltop retreats, another pattern appears. Architecture in ruins often functions as a mirror to the broader systems that produced it. A casino hotel left to rot is not just the story of a failed investment. It tells a story about greed, governance, and how quickly political violence or economic collapse can hollow out public life. A sanatorium with peeling paint is not merely a picturesque shell. It is a reminder of how medicine, stigma, and policy intersected to isolate people. A flooded quarry with submerged staircases is not only a dive site, it recalls the labor regimes that laid its foundations. It is important to say where certainty ends and interpretation begins. Many claims about past abuses, numbers dead, or institutional malfeasance are built on fragmentary records. In some cases, official archives were destroyed. In others, survivors' testimonies were marginalized. Responsible narration, or exploration, acknowledges those gaps. When historians disagree, when numbers vary across studies, the phrasing should reflect that. Estimates suggest, reports indicate, witnesses recall. That approach does two things. It prevents false certainty, and it respects the complex work of reconstructing lives from incomplete evidence. There is also an imperative of safety that cannot be overstated. Across chemical contamination, structural collapse, mold, asbestos, unexploded ordnance, and unstable underwater terrain, the risks are real and varied. For sites with residual contamination, nuclear zones, industrial chemical spills, simply entering may pose long-term health hazards. For buildings that have been vacant for decades, floors and stairwells can collapse without warning. For submerged ruins, entanglement and hypothermia are ever-present threats. The ethical visitor chooses legal, guided options, respects posted warnings, and never encourages others to trespass. Finally, the images we carry home shape how we remember these places. A photograph of a sunlit corridor may be beautiful, but also incomplete if it has been stripped of context. The camera cannot replace testimony. It can, however, amplify voices when used with care. In subsequent segments, this exploration will turn toward islands like Hashima and clustered industrial ruins that held thousands at once, places where rapid abandonment happened almost overnight, and where the human elements are intense and contested. For now, the ruins we have visited so far show a breathless variety. Deserts that reclaim wealth, lakes that hide coercion, hotels that became casualties of war, and hospitals that became mausoleums of policy. As the narrative approaches places with even greater moral weight, a question hangs in the air. How do we balance curiosity with compassion? How do we honor memory without invading it? The answer is not to stop looking, but to look differently, with a commitment to context, to the people tied to the places, and to the limits of spectacle. There are stories still waiting in steel and stone, stories shaped by hunger, ambition, secrecy, and survival. Some of those stories will demand archival patience, others will require listening to voices long pushed to the margins. Next, the exploration will turn its lens to islands of industry and to institutions whose abandonment still resonates with the families of those who lived and died there. The coming segments will probe the dense human histories cloaked in concrete. Histories of forced labor, sudden evacuation, and contested memory. Along the way, safety and ethical cautions remain the rule. Do not trespass, do not remove artifacts, and treat vulnerable narratives with the care they deserve. Before moving on, a final note about sources and certainty. Many of the accounts that shape our understanding of ruined places are built from newspapers, survivor testimony, government records, and scholarly work that sometimes disagree. Where figures or claims are contested, that disagreement will be made plain. Further research is recommended for anyone who wishes to dig deeper into a particular site's history. Primary sources and reputable historical studies offer the most reliable path to clarity. If any of these places unsettled you, think about why. Was it the sense of sudden absence? The idea that structures can outlast the people they were built for? Or the realization that systems, economic, medical, political, can leave human debris. Share which site affected you most in the comments, and, if you want more explorations like this, subscribe for the next installment. Above all, remember, ruins are not playgrounds. Respect local laws, heed safety warnings, and keep in mind the people whose stories are sealed inside these walls. On a jagged strip of rock just off Nagasaki's coast sits an island whose silhouette once looked like a warship, a concrete fortress rising from the sea. Hashima, known to many as Gunkanjima or Battleship Island, is a compact vertical town built on coal. Its history begins in the late 19th century, when industrial demand drove Mitsubishi and other companies to pile housing, factories, and seawalls into an acreage little bigger than a football field. At its height, the island held thousands of people in concrete apartment blocks, schools, shops, and bathhouses, an urban density that felt almost engineered to squeeze profit from space. The secret under that density is darker than the skyline. As war spread across Asia in the 1930s and 1940s, labor practices shifted. Reports indicate that Korean and Chinese laborers, and in some cases prisoners, were brought to Hashima under coercive conditions to maintain the mines. Survivors' testimonies, archival fragments, and later scholarship paint a picture of forced labor and harsh oversight, accounts that were contested at times and that vary in detail, which is why historians urge caution when citing specific figures. What remains indisputable is that human hands did the island's work under pressures that were not always voluntary, and those human stories became part of how the place was abandoned almost overnight. When the coal seams that sustained Hashima declined and Japan's energy mix changed, the island's corporate raison d'etre evaporated. By 1974, the company formally closed the mine, and families left in stages. Within months, the streets went quiet. Buildings that had been full of daily life, children's laughter, shopkeepers' calls, the rhythms of domestic work, became shells. For decades, the exposed concrete faced sea spray and typhoons. Rust bled along stairwells. Floors collapsed where supports weakened. In recent years, Hashima has been partly open to tourists through guided excursions supervised from the mainland, but much of the island remains fenced and off-limits because of structural danger. Conservationists and descendants of former residents have pressed for remembrance and accurate acknowledgement of wartime labor issues. In 2015, the island's World Heritage status carried controversy precisely because historical interpretation intersects with painful truths. Visitors who go to Hashima must do so in ways that respect both the physical risk, crumbling concrete, falling debris, and the moral obligation to honor those whose labor built the place. A different kind of silence lives inside castles that were never intended for industry. Chateau Miranda in Belgium was a 19th-century neo-Gothic pile whose turrets once spoke of romantic refuge. Later, however, parts of the castle were repurposed in ways that would complicate any tidy historical narrative. At times, it housed children and vulnerable people, and over decades, allegations and rumors gathered. Testimonies from former residents, occasional investigative pieces, and a thicket of local legend. Some of the claims about neglect and abuse have been substantiated by interviews and reports. Other stories exist only in oral memory. What binds them is the ethical difficulty of telling such tales. When a building shelters the vulnerable and then decays, who should control the narrative? Survivors, local governments, historians, or enthusiasts who see only photogenic ruin? Chateau Miranda was closed and left to decay, and later reported demolition removed much of the physical fabric that might have been converted into a memorial or researched site. When a place like that disappears, the opportunity to interrogate the past in situ vanishes with it. Demolition can be practical when structures are unsafe, but it also risks erasure, especially for sites linked to human suffering. Conservators and advocates argue that a better path is preservation, paired with clear interpretation, not to sanitize the past, but to make room for testimony, documentation, and restitution where it is due. Where that balance fails, communities can be left with monuments to nostalgia rather than honest memorials. Across landscapes grand and intimate, abandonment sometimes lands at the foot of a single tree. Consider a private treehouse perched in the backlot of a suburban yard, a place of scraped knees, whispered secrets, and childhood kingdoms. The planks darken and the rope frays over a decade. The family that built it fractures in ways both ordinary and catastrophic. A storm topples the structure. Inside, a small tin still holds a postcard and a carved wooden toy. These personal ruins carry a quiet cruelty. They are not public monuments, but repositories of private grief. For the families involved, such objects are talismans of memory, not props for exploration. A fictional example helps to clarify why intimate decay deserves a different etiquette than abandoned public sites. The Jensen family built a treehouse in the late 1990s as a refuge for two children and their sometimes absent parents. Over time, tensions increased. By the mid-2000s, the house stood unused, its echoes kept only by wind. One winter, when a family tragedy made private pain visible to neighbors, the treehouse became a focus for rumor and speculation. Photographs taken by curious passers-by circulated on social media. Strangers debated what had happened, and some treated the site as an aesthetic curiosity. For the Jensens, the circulated images reopened wounds. The lesson is plain. Private ruins are not fair game. Respect for people still living with loss must trump the desire for an evocative photograph. If a site is on private land, legal and ethical boundaries apply. And beyond legality, decency demands restraint. From personal anchors to consecrated floors, architecture sometimes hides bone and ritual beneath polish. In parts of Scandinavia, medieval churches carry traces of a practice that feels at once routine and macabre to modern eyes: the interment of the dead within and beneath church floors. Archaeological work during restoration of several wooden stave churches and later masonry churches has revealed human remains, animal bones, and votive objects tucked beneath planks, suggesting both religious practice and a pragmatic use of sacred space. In places like Norway, stave churches are preserved as heritage sites. Their wooden shingles and carved portals now shield layers of history that include both devotion and mortality. The discovery of bones beneath floorboards is seldom cinematic in the way popular media imagines. It is often an archaeologist's patient sorting of fragments, pottery, and soil strata. Analysts can learn much about diet, disease, and social status, but they must also navigate modern sensitivities. When a floorboard yields a skull fragment, conservationists consult descendant communities and ecclesiastical authorities. In some cases, reburial or memorialization is appropriate. These are not ghost stories for urban explorers to exploit. They are human remains that demand protocol, documentation, and respect. The practical takeaway is that heritage management includes moral stewardship, and what is found in sacred places belongs first to the communities connected to them. Many psychiatric institutions and sanatoriums sit somewhere between the personal and the public. Designed to care, they became sites of control. Craig House and similar institutions in Britain and elsewhere illustrate the social complexity of such facilities. Craig House itself, a Victorian mansion converted into a hospital for mental health patients, served people from different social strata and accommodated treatments that ranged from compassionate care to practices later judged harsh or ineffectual. Fires, understaffing, and changing medical fashions contributed to the decline of many such institutions. In some cases, buildings were repurposed. In others, they were simply left to rot. Survivors' words and institutional archives often disagree on the finer points. What was therapeutic for one person might have been traumatic for another, and official records sometimes obscure as much as they reveal. The ethical dimension of exploring and documenting these places is acute. Medical records are confidential. Artifacts left behind, pill bottles, personal letters, mobility aids, are intimate remnants of lives that once intersected with professional judgment and social stigma. Where former hospitals are transformed into museums or apartments, curators face hard decisions about what to display and how to contextualize it. Preservation can honor former patients by telling inclusive histories. Commodification can re-traumatize families by presenting suffering as chic. Responsible producers of heritage recommend partnering with survivor groups, historians, and caregivers to shape narratives that are truthful, non-exploitative, and educative. Across seas, the Haludovo Palace Hotel and similar resorts chart another arc of promise to ruin, but they also reveal how political violence rearranges ordinary lives. The marble and brass of a casino-laden suite yield to damp tiles and graffiti when governance fails. Workers who once earned wages become refugees or ghosts in the story of a shuttered resort. Looting and ad hoc occupations transform interiors into palimpsests of human response to instability. For photographers and urban explorers, these interiors are visually dramatic. For locals, they are reminders of disrupted livelihoods. Ethically minded documentation asks not only, what does this look like, but whose life was interrupted and who speaks for them now. In Namibia's Kolmanskop, the desert's slow work made a poignant case against the spectacle of decay. Rooms that once hosted diamond-fueled opulence now fill with sand, and the town has been turned into a managed heritage site, where guides explain the social context of extraction, including the exploitation at the heart of colonial diamond mining. In sites like this, conservation can be an opportunity to recenter narratives away from architectural romance and toward labor histories, racialized dispossession, and economic redistribution. The best heritage practices do not merely preserve walls, they amplify voices of those historically marginalized. Back in Eastern Europe, submerged quarries like Rumu remain powerful because water both conceals and reveals. Today, the turquoise surface invites underwater photographers. Below, concrete stairs and cranes tell of enforced labor regimes and industrial logistics. That beauty is treacherous. Swimmers have drowned, divers have become trapped in submerged metal, and authorities warn of underwater hazards. The lesson repeats. Visual allure must never be mistaken for safety. Local governments have alternated between permissive and restrictive approaches, balancing tourism revenue against genuine risk. The crescendo of these examples comes not from an isolated ruin, but from the pattern they form. Across continents, abandonment arrives as the byproduct of choices, political, economic, medical, that extend beyond architecture into lives. Chernobyl and Hiroshima, two islands of absence, sit at the emotional core of that pattern. One was emptied as a result of technological catastrophe and systemic secrecy. The other was depopulated when the resource that tethered it to the mainland vanished and wartime labor practices stained its foundations. Both places force a confrontation with human agency. What decisions were made by those with power, and how did those decisions redistribute risk and ruin across social lines? That confrontation brings responsibility for contemporary spectators. Dark tourism, the desire to witness places associated with death, disaster, or suffering, raises ethical questions that cannot be answered by curiosity alone. Who benefits when a disaster site becomes a spectacle? Who is harmed? Does filming raise awareness that helps survivors, or does it repackage trauma for entertainment? Responsible engagement starts with humility. Archival research should accompany images. Consent and consultation with affected communities should precede publication. And attention to legality and safety is non-negotiable. Where real harm has occurred, memorialization and preservation that center survivors' narratives are often preferable to open-access tourism. Practical rules follow from that ethic. Do not enter cordoned-off areas. They are often restricted for safety or preservation reasons. Avoid removing artifacts. A child's toy left in a classroom is not a souvenir. When sharing images, include context, dates, sources, and the limits of certainty. Use qualifiers, reports indicate, estimates suggest, witnesses recall, when facts are contested. Support local preservation efforts if possible, whether by donating to heritage programs or amplifying survivor-led initiatives. And when a place involves contamination, radiological, chemical, biological, accept that some dangers are invisible and long-lived. Throughout this exploration, the push and pull of attraction and aversion remains instructive. Ruins evoke aesthetic responses, the way light falls down an empty corridor or how rust patterns lace a stairwell. But aesthetics divorced from accountability is impoverished. A photograph that arrests the eye but erases labor histories flattens reality. Conversely, images paired with careful sourcing and survivor testimony can catalyze public interest in conservation and reparative action. What are the obligations of storytellers in this space? First, to be accurate within the limits of evidence. When sources conflict, narrators must say so. Second, to be compassionate. Prioritize the dignity of people connected to these places. Third, to be mindful of consequence. Publicity can bring beneficial attention and destructive foot traffic in equal measure. Balancing these demands often means choosing slower, collaborative forms of storytelling over quick viral snapshots. And what of memory itself? Ruins are repositories of absence, but they also invite repair through memory work. Commemoration projects, oral histories, and interpretive centers can transform decay into education. In some communities, former industrial sites have been turned into museums that document labor struggles. In others, evacuated towns have become living research zones where scientists study environmental recovery while memorial plaques honor lives lost. These approaches do not erase pain, but they open pathways for recognition and, occasionally, restitution. As the light fades on this tour of abandonment's darker corners, a question lingers. What will remain when a place finally falls beyond repair? The answer is not the same for every ruin. For some, preservation is possible and desirable. For others, natural reclamation will continue regardless of human will. What stories are preserved will depend on who records them now. That is why disciplined, respectful documentation matters. It increases the chances that the partners most affected, descendants, displaced workers, former patients, have a voice in how the past is told. If you found one of these places haunting, consider which aspect unsettled you most. The systemic choices that produce ruin, the human lives caught in those processes, or our own appetite for images of decay. The better response to that unease is not voyeurism, but inquiry. Read survivor accounts, look for archival work, support local heritage efforts, and when visiting, choose legal, guided options that center safety and respect. Tell us in the comments which site on this journey unsettled you most and why. Subscribe for more careful explorations that combine history, ethics, and on-the-ground reporting. Above all, remember this simple but important rule. Ruins carry people's stories. Honor them by seeking truth with humility, and never treat a place of suffering as mere scenery.